My name is Instructor Muriel Howard, and this week we will cover BC 2011 Week 1, Chapter 4 of the Step-by-Step. This presentation will teach you how to identify your main term when dealing with ICD coding. You will also learn how to use the index and tabular list together. This first slide gives us an example how to use both the alpha index and the tabular list. Our first diagnosis is Hodgkin disease, and when we look in the index, we are told to see the word lymphoma. Lymphoma represents the main term. Remember, you must always search for your codes by the main term in the alpha index, which is listed as bold or red type font in the alpha index. The subterm is further indented underneath your main term, just like this example here. So the main term lymphoma and the subterm is Hodgkin. We are given a reference code of C81.9. We use the reference code C81.9 and verify this code in the tabular list. We begin with the 3-digit category of C81. This category code represents Hodgkin disease. We have a few examples to review in our tabular list. Our first example, when we get to C81, has a code indented a little further underneath with the 0.9 placement value at the end. This code represents Hodgkin lymphoma unspecified. Then we see another code, C81.90, which also represents Hodgkin lymphoma unspecified, but this is also classified to unspecified site. The 5th digit represents a subclassification of our code. C81 is the category, C81.9 is the subcategory, and C81.90 is the subclassification code. Remember, in order to code to the highest level of specificity, we have to read and verify the notes indicated in the tabular list to ensure our coding is complete and correct before assigning. We will usually see a big bold red dot next to a code that is incomplete, explaining that additional digits must be used. So the code that we will choose for this example is C81.90, which represents unspecified Hodgkin disease, unspecified site. We will further discuss how to locate your codes correctly in this presentation a little bit further. Now let's talk about the level of specificity. The level of specificity requires that we report the highest character available. Just like in the example, we started with the 3-digit category of C81. As we see, reviewing the tabular list, we'll see several symbols that represent that the code is incomplete. So we have to continue to search down the page until we find a code with the highest character available. We cannot report a 5th character if the 6th character is available. The highest level of specificity in ICD-10 requires 7 characters for some code assignments. Here's an example. M48.48XA. The A is the 7th character assignment for this code. When there is no 6th character available, we must use a placeholder of X. We will see those as we continue to code and use our index. There's a 7th character placeholder of A at the end to represent the initial encounter. As we see in the example underneath, there is an appropriate 7th character to be added to this particular subcategory code of M48.5. When we review this code in a tabular list, we are given examples of the seventh character and what they represent. The A represents the initial encounter for this fracture, the D is a subsequent encounter, and the G is a subsequent encounter for a fracture when there is a delayed healing, and the S represents the sequela of the fracture, of which we will discuss a little bit further in this presentation. Now we will get into integral conditions. An integral condition represents a condition where the diagnosis is stated, but there are signs and symptoms that are also stated. For example, we have fever and shortness of breath due to pneumonia. Our diagnosis that's stated at this particular encounter is pneumonia. The fever and shortness of breath are signs and symptoms of pneumonia. So we would only report the code for pneumonia. We do not need to code the additional signs and symptoms of shortness of breath and fever. Here's an example of when the conditions are not integral to the diagnosis. The sign or symptom is not a part of the disease or the condition. In those cases, we will report those particular diagnoses separately. We have pneumonia and dehydration reported or documented at the same time. Here's J18.9 for pneumonia. We also code the E86.0 for dehydration. As you get further into your coding process and as you gain experience, this particular rule will become more and more familiar to you. So the reason why these particular signs and symptoms or this additional code is reported with pneumonia is because not every patient with pneumonia has dehydration. I'm going to back up a little bit so that we can look at the signs and symptoms for the other condition. So as we see here, fever and shortness of breath due to pneumonia. We have the words due to in the sentence. Fever and shortness of breath is usually what happens when any patient has pneumonia. That's what makes these conditions integral to the main problem. In this example, dehydration was not stated to be due to pneumonia. Therefore, we will code dehydration as well as pneumonia. Additionally, as you get into coding for signs and symptoms, you will become familiar with the fact that most of those codes begin with the letter R. Now we discuss etiology and manifestations. We have diabetic retinopathy. Diabetes is the etiology or the cause of the retinopathy. Retinopathy, is the manifestation or a symptom of the main disease. There is a combination code that represents both conditions. We have the code E11.319, which represents type 1 diabetic retinopathy. We also have E10.319 in the 2016 edition. There's an additional example of Staphylococcus aureus cellulitis of the face. We have multiple codes for this particular example. We would code cellulitis, and then we will also code the B95.61 for the staphylococcal infection. So how did we come up with those codes? We have the example diabetic retinopathy, where the main term, diabetes, is used as your search term in the alpha index of your ICD manual. Remember, your main terms are bold type with subterms indented underneath in alphabetic order. As you can see in this example, we have a large list of subterms underneath the word diabetes or diabetic. So we also have the word subterm to locate under here. As you can see, it's alphabetically listed. So what you may have to do is look 2 or 3 columns over, or even the next page, to find the R's to locate retinopathy. There's a lot of codes listed underneath diabetes, so be very careful as you're searching to make sure that you're not overlooking your subterm. Your phrase or your main term, once again, is diabetes. Your subterm is retinopathy. Use this as an example to locating your diagnosis code all the time. So we will continue to search down the page until you see the subterm retinopathy. Or once again, in your case, you may have to go a few pages in or a few columns over. As you can see, there's a little note here that says, wait a minute. We have to verify this code in a tabular list for additional guidelines. The word retinopathy gives us a reference code of E11.391. Here's the rule: never code from the alpha index. You take this code, go over to your tabular list, which is located further in the back of the book, and you will see the codes beginning with an alpha character, starting with the A's, and then further you'll find the E's. A few chapters in. There are 17 chapters in the ICD-10 manual. As you can see, we have instructional notes for this. We also have some inclusion notes. So as you look in your page, you're going to see a little bit more information than this. But one of the things I want to draw your attention to is the fact that you will need to locate, you would need to include a digit representing which eye. This is a 7 character. So you will either have a right, 1 for right eye, 2 for left eye, 3 for bilateral, and 9 for unspecified eye. In our example, we did not have an eye or a laterality, so our code ends with a 9 for unspecified. Now we're going to discuss how to code acute and chronic conditions. When it is the same condition and the doctor documents that the condition is both acute and chronic, we would code, or we would go to the indentation and the index and see if they are indented on the same level. As you can see, this example, pancreatitis, we have an indentation on, or the first level indentation of acute, and we also have a first level indentation of chronic underneath. We would report acute first. So there are times when you have to pay attention to your sequencing when you're dealing with diagnosis coding. Which code or which condition is coded first? Here's an example of when there is a rule for it. You must code the acute first when they are on the same level of indentation. So for example, if you see acute indented on the first level and chronic indented further inward, like these are, then you don't have to pay attention. You would only code the acute. But in this case, you're going to code them both. Acute, K8 5.9, verify this in the tabular, and then chronic, K8 6.1. Now we'll discuss combination codes. A combination code is used to report 2 diagnoses, or a diagnosis with a manifestation like we saw with the diabetic retinopathy. It can also be used to report a diagnosis with an associated complication. Here's an example, K80.1 BC2011 Acute cholecystitis with cholelithiasis. This code represents this one condition or multiple conditions with one code. So this is technically two diagnoses: cholecystitis, which is inflammation of the gallbladder, with cholelithiasis, which represents stones in the gallbladder. Now we have the residual and the cause. The word sequela represents a residual condition. A residual condition is the problem of a condition that existed in the past that's still being treated today. For example, malunion of a fracture. This is when the fracture heals inappropriately. That represents a residual of the actual fracture that happened sometime in the past. We also have the word late effect, or at this point is called sequela of fracture, which is the cause. So when you look for, or if you see the term late effect that you need to code in a scenario, you would not locate that in the alpha index. You would have to, or you would be referenced to the word sequela. Sequela then becomes your main term. And then in this case, we have sequela of a fracture. So it's telling us, one of the rules is that we will report the residual as your first listed diagnosis when you're dealing with sequencing. And then you would follow up by the late effect code. There are some combination codes that reports one code and others require two. You'll see that as you continue to code. One good example of learning how to understand this type of coding, residual and cause, is when you're dealing with fractures. Now we will discuss laterality. Laterality represents the side of the body, as we saw earlier in the example for retinopathy. You have two eyes, two legs, two ears, 2 feet, 2 hands. So with ICD-10 coding, we have the capability of coding for either the left side, the right side, or unspecified side. So in this example, we have M70.84. In this example, in the tabular list, we see a big bold red dot. Remember, this big bold red dot tells us that we need to use additional digits. So this is an example of how you use the tabular list. We see that indented underneath this code, we have additional codes. They all end with a different character. The 1 represents the right hand, and the 2 represents the left hand, and then finally the 9 represents the unspecified hand. We will see that a lot when we're dealing with, once again, injuries or problems related to our extremities. And that is the end of the basics for ICD-10 coding. Thank you for viewing. You should follow along with Chapter 4 as I cover the information in this presentation. Please reach out to me or your instructor if you have questions. Have a great day.